Hi, for those who haven't had a chance to meet me yet, my name is Martin Uren, and I look after the research and insight team for Twitter, based out of Singapore. We cover the entire APAC region. Today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you a project which we have been working on, which is focused on decoding the gaming audience across 2020. So the projects that we're working on today, what are the three component parts? First of all, what we actually observed as soon as we got through to the start of the pandemic, we saw a huge rise in the number of articles which were talking constantly about the role of gaming, how much gaming was playing a role in people's lives. From this, what we decided to do was go through and see if some of these conversation trends actually bore out through our Twitter data. And finally, what we saw, which is hopefully what I'd like to share with you today, is how we then started to dig into this data and the role of people's actual tweets in giving us some insight that we can use for our qualitative findings. As we've seen in the majority of populations going into lockdown, we're not surprised to see this particular rise. What we actually wanted to do was we actually wanted to kind of see this interesting debate, because what we could see with a lot of the major studios that they were actually starting to see production finish, we were actually starting to see, could we see that gaming is actually able to satisfy more of the need states and finally be in a position to rival, and if not champion, the role of TV for entertainment. When we think about gaming, we have to consider how long gaming has been present within the home. It's not unfeasible to think of most current gamers as actually second generation. Second generation is really interesting because these people have less resistance. If you are one of these family members, you will kind of remember your parents telling you to stop playing games. This will sort of start to decay. If you're a family member of Hamako Mori from Japan, you might even actually be a fourth generation gamer because she was recognized recently as the oldest gamer on the planet. And gaming has been present for the past 4 decades, growing and evolving over time. What started with NES and Sega in the 90s in the home has really expanded into portable gaming through the 2000s and accelerated post the launch of the iPhone in 2007. Really what changed with the iPhone when it launched in gaming was the high portable processing power that it could offer. And gaming then started to over in app development with the launch of global mobile games such as Angry Birds through to Candy Crush by Pokemon Go, and then more recently things like Amongst Us, which if you haven't played is a great game. What we actually see is we used to see the trend heading much more towards what was described as a hyper-casual game. A hyper-casual game is something which you can play for a few seconds and then you can instantly move on. What we've actually seen as we got through to the situation where we are now with the global pandemic is actually people starting to explore longer games and connectivity, and we'll cover that through the work which we do today. To provide some context on the scale of gaming and esports within this, it's fair to make comparisons to the world of existing sports, and when you read articles, this will often happen. A key moment actually happened in 2018. In 2018, this is when people think this might be a modern phenomenon. Actually, we go back to 2018. What we actually found is that the online broadcast of the League of Legends final actually eclipsed the Super Bowl that year. The Super Bowl is often pushed as the blue ribbon event in terms of participation and viewing online. Or there's another way which you can look at the growth of esports, which is the prize money which is available for global championships. Here we see 16-year-old Booga winning the Fortnite World Championships, scooping $3 million in prize money. If you zoom in, you'll actually see that this is the same arena that a 32-year-old Novak Djokovic won a similar amount a few weeks earlier playing men's championship tennis. So let's look in a little bit more detail at this audience and some of the findings that we were able to go through. The reason why we actually thought this was a good place to start was because actually we've seen consistently that our audience is really interested in playing games. Then, as I mentioned before, when we looked through the conversations, we've always seen a rise in gaming conversation. However, when we were getting through to this period of extended lockdown, we knew this was going to be increasing faster. So far, within the Asia Pacific region, what we've actually seen is a 57% increase year on year in our gaming conversation. During the COVID period, it was actually running at 55%. So like I say, this is a trend which has been highly accelerated by the enforced lockdowns that people have gone through. This isn't a trend which has started out of nowhere. This year, we have seen a staggering 2.35 billion tweets. This is absolutely phenomenal. This has actually ranged from over 100 million authors as well. So the conversation is live. So this actually is great, because if you're looking to understand, then actually this gives us a huge pool of people where we can go in and not only look at their data from a quantitative, but as we go forward, we'll show you some of the investigations that we've done from a qualitative stance. So when we think about gaming in 2020, what I'd really like to do with you, Jay, is share with you some of the findings that we see when people are going through the COVID-19 enforced lockdowns that people are going through. Bearing in mind that some people are still in this state, and we'll also see those trends as we repeat this project in 2021. During COVID, and also through to present day, Animal Crossing was one of the most talked about games. In fact, there is a whole Animal Crossing gaming community on Twitter. People who talked about Animal Crossing during this period, they found this as a good opportunity to actually just have some fun and finding other people through the community on Twitter. What we actually saw was, of course, having fun is one of the key reasons why we play games. We don't play games to not have fun. We play games to enjoy ourselves. But also what was really interesting was that as we're going through this period, especially with Generation Z, it actually turned out to be something where people were using the format, using gaming as a way to stay connected with their friends. For example, here in Singapore, we still have maximum groups of 5 people meeting at one time. This was an opportunity that people could get together and really socialize, even if they're in a digital sense. It's really developed. What we've actually seen is a considerable amount of people playing this game, but plus also some of the more unique elements coming in for conversation. For example, here people were actually talking about the actual theme tune that's gone behind Animal Crossings. And again, this then sort of prompted the developer to release this and release the musicians that make it. At Twitter, we're not immune to this craze. We actually see one person who's actually within our research team, DJ. He actually got up and he set up his own home. He lives in downtown. This is an opportunity for him to go off and kind of create that countryside life. And if you look, he's actually made himself some Twitter merch at the same time. It's not just all about Animal Crossings. We've also seen some of the other huge franchise really sort of grow through this period in terms of conversation and events. For example, on Fortnite, there was the launch of Party Royale. Normal weapons were swapped for LED wings and lightsabers. These were all things that people used. They would go and collect these, and they would take these to the beach on the island, where they could watch DJ sets from deadmau and Steve Aoki, and partygoers could actually partake in different challenges and meet each other as well. Actually, what we see even more recently is this sort of emergence of two sort of worlds. Fortnite had an opportunity to launch the BTS video for Dynamite. And again, you can actually see the creativity that people within the game are doing to replicate, for example, here, scenes within the video. So let's actually think a little bit more about the audience. What is it about this audience? Why are we so interested in this audience? And what is it that we can see? For a lot of people, we find this sort of splits into two camps. We find a lot of people who are actually within the game developing audience, but a lot of people are marketers, brand managers. They really want to understand how they can sort of bring this audience and why should they be so interested. I think the first thing actually what we see is the sort of the level of interactivity that these people do. First of all, we see 83% of our gaming audience taking action on Twitter, but plus also we see them taking a lot of follow-up and a lot of action outside of Twitter as well. In terms of our daily, this is, this tends to be heavily focused around millennials and Gen Zs, but this isn't just a young male event. This is spread across all age groups and all demographics. These are the types of people that are going to be coming on a high frequency. The great thing about that was when we started to understand them is, again, this gives us a huge volume and we can actually see people's behavior over a particular period of time. So the project, which is the first part that we worked on in 2020, was really looking to how understand the different need states of gaming during the COVID period. Working with a core partner of ours, which is an agency called Circus Social, what we were able to do was we were able to analyze 5 million tweets between January and April. And initially, here we started off with conversations within the Southeast Asia region, but actually what you'll see today is we've actually expanded this into Japan, US, Korea, The list just really keeps going on and on and on. We've actually gone all the way through India as well. So what is it that we're talking about when we think about gaming need states? The first thing I'd like to point out is the fact that we wanted to find something where we could sort of continue to build upon. So we actually read a hell of a lot of interesting articles out there. The one thing that we wanted to come back to was how can we break this down into individual segments? First of all, there is a range of things that will always be present within gaming, whether it be achieving, thrill-seeking, unwinding, or for example, going through a level of excitement. These are always going to be present. What we actually see during COVID-19 periods is more around socializing, normalizing, and idling. Socializing, this is basically the state that people are in. People were confined within their homes. Individuals returning to gaming as a way to sort of connect with their friends, but also their family as well. Normalizing, with the pandemic, which had been disrupting everybody's lives, this was a great way that people could actually bring some sort of normality back to themselves. And idling, of course, one of the key effects of people spending more time indoors is actually just have more time. And gaming was a great way for people to pass the time during this time period. So like I say, what we're looking to do is we were looking to map people and find out if there's a relative scale. The first scale that we're looking on was around socializing. What we actually saw on one side, where we had Indonesia and Japan, was that people were looking to connect, but this wasn't really the main driving point, all the way through to Thailand and Korea, where we actually see people using gaming as a way to reach out and connect to strangers. And then we see the sort of the complete spread of countries as we go through the project. So, for example, let's think about with South Korea. What we found really interesting within South Korea was we actually saw a lot of these types of tweets. People were enforced at home. They were actually using this time to reach out and connect to strangers. This particular tweet is a great example. It was saying that they were looking for friends who like to play games, and it was really sort of saying that people were looking to reach outside of their immediate friends and family and create new contacts. Within India, what was really interesting was that we actually saw a lot of the traditional board games actually switched through to a digital footprint as well. So nowadays, as the person saying here, nowadays playing online Ludo is the most happening thing in my life. I think it's the way that people are actually sort of bringing a slight bit of humor into their lives as well. We also saw this, as I mentioned, within all markets around Animal Crossings, for example. But you also see here a little time where two people are playing the game independently, and they actually sort of come together. They sort of go onto each other's islands, and they're just enjoying those moments. Closer to home in Singapore, we see a lot of these types of tweets. For example, here, two people in a relationship, they're not within the same physical space. So what they're doing is they're using the game to actually go through and spend some time. Also, what was really interesting is that we saw that people were using this, as I mentioned, to help get around some of those quarantine rules and stay connected. People were having birthday parties, etc., on the platform as well. So then what I'd like to do is just take you into a little bit more deep dive into our second trend. And what we're looking at here was how people were using gaming to really seek some sort of normality. And we were sort of looking at a spread. What we found with countries like Japan, Korea, and Malaysia was actually it was almost developing as a part of their normal routine. Whereas what we see in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines is actually they were sort of using these games as a way to sort of escape the situation that they're in. For example, Indonesia, one thing that's really interesting in Indonesia is Indonesia really struggles with connectivity. So games that can provide that external simulated real-world experience are sort of being highly discussed. What we actually saw was one game in particular, which was The Sims. It really sort of rose in popularity, and we've seen numerous discussions. This is simply because these types of games we can play offline. And there's also another example, which is a game called Worm Zones. It's basically a 2020 version of that old Nokia game, for those people that can remember the original non-smartphones. And it sort of kicked off a really interesting conversation thread that we could go through. And it was really just how people were, like we say, finding a little bit of escapism from the situation where they are in now. There was one interesting game I play a lot of these games myself to sort of get into them. And it was really sort of, there's some really sort of interesting real world games out there at the moment. Sometimes I think they're a little bit too realistic. I don't really catch them at the meaning myself, but that's why it's great to have the Twitter data where we can go off and we can see how people are discussing these particular games. This is actually, I think, probably one of my favorite tweets. This lockdown has got to my fiance. I said to him, apparently there was a meteor shower tonight, and he asked me if this is in real life or this is in Animal Crossing. I think this is actually where we're starting to see the ultimate blurring of the lines in between what we think is actually reality and what is actually sort of game friction. Thailand, again, a sort of an interesting trend that we saw developing here was that gamings were actually being used as the true form of escapism. And this was actually being promoted as a way to minimize the stresses that people were going through. Actually, like I said, it was also promoted by the World Health Organization. For those who are interested, they were actually saying that as a great way to take care of your mental health was use gaming as a way to break your day up during COVID-19. In India, what we actually saw was there was a high number of tweets. We actually see some questions here. I won't go into this tweet, but you can kind of read the context here. People were actually even using the platforms for one of the most physical things, which was actually to go on a date. People were actually using the platform for that benefit. And again, there was almost this opportunity where it was actually becoming a very talked about tool. Within Singapore, this isn't really just sort of confined to Singapore, but we actually see this across all markets. What is really interesting is we're now noticing how gaming was being listed as one of those key events to tick off every day. So what people were talking about during the circuit breaker was they were talking about cleaning, doing, watching TV shows, eating, and gaming constantly formulates within there as something that people would just do on a daily basis. I think what was also really interesting was a lot of people were missing out on some of those key physical space. So actually what we see was people taking on to games to go off and have their own graduation ceremonies as well. Malaysia was really interesting because there was a really interesting trend where people were using gaming to provide another way to facilitate their sort of gaming, to facilitate their normal lives with gaming. Again, there's a lot of references to Animal Crossing. It really is a sort of a huge conversation trend. But actually someone is saying here that they just like to open the game and run around the island for 20 minutes. So again, people are not able to do exercise in the physical space, can actually do exercise in the digital space. I know it's not the same, but hey. And then within the US, what we actually saw was, again, people can't celebrate events in the physical space, so that's sort of coming across. Couples who were isolating, sort of separately, they were using this as a way to continue their relationship. So this is really interesting because quite often what we find is one trend might be playing itself out very differently in one market to the other. We actually see a lot of commonality between many of the markets, and I think that is one of the great insights that we could see from gaming. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just to give you a few, what else have we observed when we've been looking through particularly with a bit of an APAC lens. What do we find at individual country levels? What I thought was actually really interesting was this when we looked at the gaming conversation, it really exposed the true lack of connectivity that we found within Indonesia. There's actually a lot of mentions around where people were looking to play games, very much like how they're looking to stream content, but actually they are having the biggest constraint, which was the access to broadband. For example, here, they're only coming into the living room to play PUBG. There was a lot of opportunities to people talking about things that they could play online and offline games. And again, it just sort of goes all the way through. There was a lot of people talking about how connectivity. So I think this is something that people have probably been able to deal with by leaving the house, but actually it was really interesting. What we actually thought was also good here was there was a lot of conversation where it started off sort of a little bit more male, but actually sort of started to drive very female towards the middle of the conversation as well. One of the most talked about games like I mentioned before, was things like Wormzone and Sims, and they're really examples of people trying to normalize their lives, even in this state where they can't find that much true Wi-Fi connection. I think what was really interesting in India was that what we really saw was a lot of the barriers has sort of started to be eroded. I like this one. I was just there, I saw my mum and that's playing Ludo, and from that point hasn't said anything regarding PUBG. We actually also see that there was people sort of bridging generation gaps. So like I say, this is almost like the idling form of helping to bolster some of the normalizing that's been happening out there. Also, I thought was also another key development that there was a lot of people who were looking back in time. They were looking to see there was almost generation gaps that were being overcome, and also I think the final thing was that gaming was actually being positioned as something where people could do. They could let their children get engaged with this because it was a good way to keep people from actually leaving their house. I'm just going to see. If I go to Singapore, what I actually think was interesting with Singapore was that we saw a lot of people who very impulse purchasing towards the start of the circuit breaker. And there seems to be a mass rush to go out there and find all the last available Nintendo Switches, and people were prepared to pay. So it's really interesting to see how this type of impulse behavior was almost sort of fueling itself and moving forwards. I think actually what we see was people who were not afraid to the large price points, and again they were just using other people's data to really go off on other recommendations to go off there and to start to spend. In Thailand, what was really interesting is how esports really became part of the situation. People were actually utilizing esports as a way to raise awareness for other aspects. So we actually start to see gaming really transverse into other zones as well. Gamers and Givers was a really great example of this. The conversation around this whole particular thread was absolutely amazing. We also see, I think there was, so I'm just going to jump through a few of these. Malaysia was really interesting because there was still some resilience to the sort of the nature of gaming. The fact that, let me show you the translation, people were sort of complaining that people didn't really, people were sort of utilizing this as an opportunity just to play games and sort of ignore their family members. There's a great one here, which is about that guys won't text girls for 24 hours. They need to understand more things in life than playing Mobile Legends and PUBG. But actually, what we actually started to see was as the sort of the lockdowns have taken place, it's actually the conversation has changed considerably. What we actually see is that there's what was actually seen as an activity which was slightly wasting the people's times was actually embraced by the female members of Twitter, and again within Malaysia. Within the US, what I thought was really interesting was in the US is this sort of life simulation games really started to sort of grow in their popularity, and this is now actually I think will become one of the most interesting sectors for the gaming industry as we move forwards. Where are we now then? So what do we actually see? Well, we do see a variety of different key insights that we could take from this. We actually see that there's a great opportunity for gaming companies to sort of collaborate. We see people becoming more social. We see gender divides. We see people taking the opportunity to experience things like nostalgia and board games. But actually, I think what's really interesting is that we see some different markets around the world really start to formulate some common threads. So again, I think if we understand people's gaming activities, we can actually start to understand them as consumers a little bit more. Like I said, we've got a huge range of data, and please, I'll leave my Twitter handle up at the end. Please come back to me and DM me for any more questions that you might have later on after the Q&A. But what we actually see is we've got a huge range of insight, particularly by the Southeast Asian and main popular gaming markets around the world, places like Saudi Arabia and the US. So yeah, we also feel that this is a great project not just to understand people during this time period, but how people can change as consumers moving forwards. So if I think back to this project as a whole, where are we now? Gaming is one of these trends. It wasn't created through COVID. It's actually been accelerated. And I think as we go through these different periods of stay-at-home conditions, gaming is always going to be there now, and it's sort of really rooted within that normalizing behavior. Gaming in its sort of true activity and its true nature of interactivity, we actually feel that it's able to offer more need states. It's able to offer people the opportunity to normalize and socialize with others. And lastly, at Twitter, how we're using this data? We're really using this data as in a qualitative sense. Yes, we can see how the conversation can grow, but we're actually using Twitter much more in a qualitative sense in this case, really to understand and observe this audience, not just their gaming activities, but also try to find key insights to them as humans as well. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time. Like I say, there will be some questions and answers, but if you want to ask me anything more, please come through to my Twitter handle, which is just simply @MartinUray. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.